We're lucky to be joined by Columbia Riverkeeper's Senior Attorney Miles Johnson, and we also have Natural Resources Defense Council Senior Attorney Giulia Good Stefani with us tonight. So we're very excited about that. And Miles works to reduce water pollution and toxic contamination by enforcing the Clean Water Act and providing legal counsel for Riverkeeper's campaign to stop dirty fossil fuel exports. And Giulia specializes in working with marine animals and wild places and communities, protecting marine animals, wild places, and communities from environmental injustices. So we're really excited about having them here tonight, and I thank you both for joining us. And I just want to start the evening with a land acknowledgement. We recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge that Portland and Hood River rest on the traditional lands of Native people who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. So as you know, tonight we're going to be learning from Miles and Giulia about Lower Snake River Dam removal. And I just want to jump right in, and we're going to hear from Miles first, then we're going to hear from Giulia.
Name is Miles. I'm a senior attorney at Columbia Riverkeeper, and we're going to be talking about bringing back salmon and orcas by removing Snake River dams. Next slide. So just a little bit about Columbia Riverkeeper. I know a lot of you out there are Columbia Riverkeeper members. Thank you so much for supporting this organization. Columbia Riverkeeper works up and down the Columbia River and throughout the basin to keep our waterways clean, our fish healthy to eat, and just basically allow everyone to enjoy the benefits of a clean and healthy river. So thank you so much for everyone who supports Riverkeeper. And if you don't support Riverkeeper yet, if you're not a member, you can go to our website, support what we're doing, and we will we'll keep you up to date on conservation and river protection in the Columbia Basin, tell you how to make your voice heard, and how we can move forward on this issue together. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about Columbia River, Snake River salmon recovery and orca recovery today. And I just want to pause and acknowledge that this issue is just incredibly complex. From the biology of these fish to the complexity of the river basin, and all of the different ways in which we've come to depend on it. We're not going to be able to speak to all of that today. So I just want to acknowledge that we're going to be focusing on salmon and steelhead, particularly in the Snake River Basin, and how removing dams would help those fish and the orcas that depend on them recover. So a little bit about where we are, the Snake and Columbia River Basin. These used to be the biggest producers of salmon on the planet. At one point, maybe 15 million adult salmon and steelhead a year returned to the rivers. They supported healthy populations of orcas and other predators, and really robust tribal, commercial, and subsistence fisheries. Next slide, please. So in the last 150 years, unfortunately, those fisheries have really collapsed in a lot of ways, and especially in the Snake River Basin, which used to be, one of the real engines of salmon production in the Columbia River Basin. The fisheries in the Snake have really declined. These fish on this slide are sockeye. At one point in time, maybe 30,000 adult sockeye would return through the Columbia River up the Snake River and spawn in mountain lakes in central Idaho. Over the last decade, we've been lucky if there's 100 of these fish make it back to Idaho, and in some years, you know, there's as few as, you know, 1 or 10 or something like that. So the Snake River sockeye are in decline. Unfortunately, Snake River steelhead and especially spring and summer Chinook are also, you know, it's not hyperbole to say that they're in a state of collapse. You know, their runs are not quite at the level of sockeye, but they are declining drastically. And a lot of, well, the biologists are starting to predict that if we don't do something meaningful for these fish in the next decade or two, we're going to start looking at the extinction of a lot of the salmon runs, especially in the Snake River. Next slide, please. So just to kind of ground us in where we are, this is the Columbia River Basin. It drains most of the Pacific Northwest. It used to be, most of it used to be habitat for spawning salmon and steelhead. Next slide. So this is my rough approximation of kind of what we've lost in broad strokes. You know, the yellow outlined area to the north is the upper Columbia Basin, which was cut off, you know, by the construction of Grand Coulee Dam. And the shaded area on the south is the upper Snake watershed, which was cut off by the construction of the Hells Canyon Dam complex. Next slide. So what we're talking about when we talk about, you know, Snake River Dam removal to facilitate salmon recovery is really this area here. And kind of by comparison to those other two areas, it doesn't look all that big, but it's, you know, most of central and north Idaho, the Clearwater and salmon basins. It's really a huge area. And, you know, it's important to talk about why this area is so so special. It's largely, you know, national forest, wilderness area, not pristine, but also not nearly as heavily impacted by development and other types of land uses as a lot of the other places in the Columbia Basin. So it's still relatively good spawning habitat and rearing habitat for salmon and steelhead. And it's also at high altitude, which means that it's going to be more resilient than other places in the basin to the effects of climate change. So this is really where the big focus for salmon recovery in the Columbia Basin is right now. It's a huge opportunity, but in order to get there, salmon have to make it past 8 dams, 4 on the lower Columbia and 4 on the lower Snake River. If you go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So here's a little less realistic depiction of the river, but in terms of Snake River dams, there are 4 dams on the Snake between Pasco and Lewiston, but between basically the Tri-Cities in Washington and the Idaho border. And that means that there's an extra 140 miles or so of slackwater reservoir and 4 dams that the fish have to negotiate in order to make it back to central Idaho, to all that good habitat that we were just talking about. Next slide. So I want to take just a second and talk about why dams and reservoirs are such problems for these fish. You know, I think a lot of times when we talk about the dams being hard on fish, people think about the fish going through the dam, but it's really more systemic than that. This is a picture of McNary Dam out in eastern Washington on the main stem Columbia River. And so from a fish's perspective, salmon evolved in a river that was big and cold for most of the year. It flowed quickly. And it was actually relatively muddy or turbid a lot of the time, especially in the spring when when young salmon were migrating out to sea. And we've basically changed that whole dynamic by creating a series of reservoirs. We've gone from a kind of a fast, cold, murky river to a very slow, warmer, and clear river. And then on top of that, we've added passage over the dams, which creates additional problems. Next slide, please. And, for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm kind of going to talk about how those changes have affected fish. And the first one is passage over the dam. So if you're a young salmon moving down the river, you're trying to go from from upstream to downstream, from the right side of this screen to the left side. How are you going to get around these dams? Well, you're going to move in one of two ways. You're going to move either over the spillways, and in this picture, all that white water at the base of the dam there is going over the spillway. It's basically flowing over the top of the dam. Next slide, please. But if you don't go over the spillway, you're going to go through the powerhouse, which is this big structure kind of in the foreground of this picture. This is McNary Dam. And if you go through the powerhouse as a fish, you're likely going through the dam's turbines. And as you might expect, that's a trip that a lot of fish don't survive. So you're either going over the spillway or through the powerhouse. And this this dynamic is controlled by where most of the water in the river is going. If most of the water in the river is spilling over the spillway, most of the fish will go over the spillway and they'll survive better. But if most of the water in the river is going through the powerhouse, then most of the young fish will too, and they won't survive as well. And so this is what people talk about when you may have heard discussions of spill. We need more spill in the river to help fish. I think there's kind of a common misconception about what that means, that we're releasing more water. That's not really true. Kind of the amount of water going downstream is always, more or less the same, but spill refers to the amount of the river that's going over the spillway, which is good for fish, versus through the turbine, which is bad for fish. And the fight there is, if you send more water over the spillway, then you're not sending it through the turbines, and therefore you're not creating electricity. So BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration, which is the agency that markets the power made by the dams, and the utilities, which are kind of the customers, lobby for less spill and more power generation. And for decades, environmental groups have been lobbying for more spill over the dams. Next slide. So, moving on from passage over the dams themselves, how are the reservoirs affecting fish survival? And for the next little bit, I'd like to talk about predators. Columbia and Snake River salmon have always supported a lot of predators, whether you're talking about orcas or humans who use these fish, or seals and sea lions, or birds like cormorants and terns and gulls. There are also fish that eat young salmon, there are some native fish like bull trout and pike minnow. A lot of the reservoirs, all of the reservoirs in the Columbia and Snake now have non-native fish species that eat juvenile salmon, like smallmouth bass and walleye. And there's a lot of discussion about predators and predator control. I don't want to get into that because it could easily fill another another webinar like this. But I do want to point out that there's a significant amount of predation on salmon and steelhead, and I don't want to pretend that that's not the case. It really is a problem for especially juvenile fish trying to move out through the system of reservoirs. If you go to the next slide. You know, but I guess what I'd like to emphasize is, you know, whatever you think about predator management, the predator problems are a symptom of the river as we've created it. You know, the dams concentrate adult fish so that they're much easier for seals and sea lions to catch. The reservoirs make the river warmer and clearer, and that makes it a lot easier for predatory fish like smallmouth bass and walleye to hunt. The clear rivers also make it a lot easier for birds to see fish and capitalize on juvenile salmonids that would probably be able to survive better in a river that was big and turbid and cold. So, you know, removing Snake River dams would transform a large portion of the migratory corridor back to a more natural river, in which case the you know, the young salmon trying to migrate out would be migrating in an environment to which they had adapted and to which their predators, where their predators would be a lot less effective. Go ahead. And the final issue I want to talk about today is temperature. So this is a picture of a sockeye salmon taken in 2015 when we had low flows and a very warm spring, and it caused the Columbia and Snake Rivers to become very warm during the part of the year when sockeye salmon are trying to migrate through the rivers. And there was just a phenomenal die-off of sockeye. I think 250,000 fish that had, you know, adult fish that had lived most of their life cycle and were about to spawn. They came back into the lower Columbia and the Snake, and they encountered warm water and they died. And this was really a wake-up call to Columbia Riverkeeper and a lot of other people too. And so what does this have to do with the dams and the reservoirs? You know, as we started looking into the problem of water temperatures, it became really apparent to us that the reservoirs, especially in eastern Washington, on the Snake River, these reservoirs are kind of big and flat. They have a lot of surface area. They absorb a lot of the sun's energy, and it actually causes the water to warm up, sometimes by a whole degree or two. And when you look at the effects of 4 or even more reservoirs in sequence, you know, that kind of warming of the river really takes the river to a point where it's difficult for adult fish to migrate upstream. Generally speaking, when water temperatures make it into the mid to high 60s, it becomes really hard for adult salmon to migrate upstream. The water, when it's that warm, doesn't contagion. Fish start to experience disease, like the fish in this picture with a fungal infection. And fish stop migrating. And when they stop migrating, they get stressed out. They start using up more of their energy. If they have, so they're carrying eggs or sperm in their bodies at this point. And they're basically, their reproductive organs start to degrade. They just basically get stressed by hot water, and start to die, or even if they don't die outright, it can oftentimes lead to poor reproductive success. So we started looking into this problem. It turns out, between the dams and climate change, the rivers, and especially the lower Snake out in eastern Washington, where it gets really warm, it this problem of high summer water temperatures, we think is really kind of is reaching a tipping point where it's going to make it very difficult for sockeye and other fish like fall chinook, like steelhead, that migrate in the summer to survive. Next slide. So how do we know that that dam removal would correct some of the water temperature problems in the Snake River? Well, it turns out that EPA and the Army Corps and other people have, it has not been a secret that there are temperature problems in the river, and actually those agencies have developed some pretty sophisticated modeling tools to look at what the river might be like without the dams. And so a couple of years ago, Columbia Riverkeeper was able to use those models to look at what this lower Snake River would have been like in 2015, in that really hot year where we had pretty severe fish die-offs, to look at what the temperature in the river would have been like without the dams in place. And so on the left side of your screen, you see what the actual river temperatures would have been at each of the 4 lower Snake dams throughout the river. That red line on the top is Ice Harbor Dam. It's the lowest dam on the Snake River. And you can see that in 2015, the river got into the 70s, too hot for salmon migration in July, and basically stayed too hot until September. Whereas on the right side of your screen, that's the projected temperatures without the dams in place. And you can see that occasionally the river got too hot, but for the most part, without the dams, even in that really hot year, the lower Snake would have been safe for salmon. And, salmon can survive occasional temperature spikes above 68 degrees. These are desert rivers. These fish are adapted to that. They can take a little bit of hot water. What they can't take is what you see on the left side of the slide, which is water that's way too hot and stays too hot for months on end. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is the most wonky slide I will show you. And I'm sorry for confusion it may cause, but I think it's important to see this because it really ties together some of the threats that I've been talking about. So this is the result of a study by an agency called the Fish Passage Center. There's a federal agency that's fairly small, but is completely dedicated to studying how the dams impact fish survival. And without getting into too much detail, that red line is through the middle of this graph, is the line at which fish populations, in this case Snake River spring chinook, either recover or fail to recover and decline. And what this is telling you is that this federal agency used decades worth of data to model salmon populations in the future, and the outcome was that if you remove the lower Snake River dams, it was very likely under any water or climate condition that Snake River spring chinook would recover. But if you did not remove Snake River dams, even if you substantially increase the amount of spill or do other things to promote salmon restoration, it's unlikely that you're going to achieve salmon recovery in the lower Snake River. So I'll stop there. Again, thank you for your patience with the technology, and we really appreciate you tuning in.
Okay. This is a image of the headwaters of the Snake River. Of course, no salmon and no orcas there, but a beautiful reminder of where all this starts and the sort of intricate web of connection that salmon weave. We can go to the next slide. As Kate mentioned, I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. For those of you not familiar with NRDC, we work on a wide variety of issues. Climate change is obviously at the forefront. I'm on a small team that works to protect marine mammals, and there's a picture of our lovely new president, Gina McCarthy, former administrator of the EPA under Obama, and my work to protect whales and dolphins and other marine mammals brought me to this issue. Next slide. There's a small population of orcas or killer whales that live not too far from here. And they are really what drew me to this story. This is a graphic representation done a couple of years ago by Perrin Ireland, who works here at NRDC, of the full population of the southern resident orcas. There are today only 72 or potentially 73 of these animals remaining. They're split into 3 pods: J pod, K pod, and L pod. And they were made international news couple of years ago when, as was mentioned in that short video, Talequa J35 pushed her newborn, it lived for a matter of moments, her dead calf for 17 days or over 1,000 miles. And these animals are really quite unique. They are unique from other orcas in that they have a food preference that's very strong, and they only eat pretty much salmon. About 80% of their diet is salmon, and predominantly Chinook salmon. They also, there's a couple other sort of fun facts about these orcas. They live in matriarchal clusters. So a baby orca stays with its mother for its whole life. And they can live for as long as 105 years. The oldest known orca in the world, in fact, was of this population. She was estimated to be about 105 years old and passed away last year. And when you think about that, you realize just sort of the memory of these animals. I mean, she experienced and knew a world before the hydroelectric dams on the Columbia that we're talking about. And so truly has lived that change here. Next slide. So here is just another graphic representation or a map of where you can find the southern residents and their range. They go as far north as British Columbia and as far south as California. They're often thought of as Puget Sound orcas or Sailor Sea orcas, but indeed they really are Pacific Northwest animals. They're called residents because they stay close to the shore, and this has also really enabled us to get to know them and to study them. They are quite arguably the most studied whales on the planet. There's a dedicated set of researchers that has been watching them on the water for over 40 years. Every individual has a name and number. And we know a fair amount about their family structures and their personalities, and also accordingly a fair amount about the challenges that they are facing currently. This is the photograph on the right is an image of 2 female southern resident orcas. One is a pretty healthy individual there on the left, and the right one is a young, she's 23 years old, emaciated female. And this is from a drone study, and this aerial drone study has allowed us to really monitor the body condition in an uninvasive way of the southern residents, and to document their physical decline as they experience a shortage of their preferred food of salmon. We are seeing the whales literally starving, and unfortunately we've also got studies documenting their inability really to bring calves to term. About 70% of pregnancies are miscarriages or losses, often late term, and the thinking there is that these animals are so nutritionally stressed, it becomes very difficult during pregnancy to hold on to that calf if you don't have sufficient food. And of the calves that are born, only about 50% survive. So Talequa's story of her deceased calf is unfortunately fairly common. So there is a lot of concern around the animals with a very small population now, very sort of charismatic megafauna here, just really at our doorstep, who are suffering in the way of so many other species, the loss of salmon to our region. Next slide. So as I said, these are really well-studied animals, and one of the studies that was conducted by NOAA actually was to place tags on this is the images of a killer whale, looks like a male to me, one of the southern residents, with a tag on its dorsal fin, and this enabled us to track where these animals are going. So we knew a fair amount about the time they spend in the Salish Sea and Puget Sound, because that was close to Seattle, close to the San Juan Islands. People see them there, but when they're out on the coast, people had a lot less knowledge about where were these whales going, so they typically spend large portions of their summer months, although that is changing, in Puget Sound and the Salish Sea, and they're feeding on Fraser River salmon predominantly. But then in the winter months and in the spring months and early summer sometimes as well, they're out at the coast, and we had a lot less information about where they are. And this is one of the satellite tags and tracking. It's a particular whale here, but you see the track lines, and it's a little difficult to read this map, but if you look closely, that's the Columbia River, and they are spending a disproportionate amount of time, far greater than you would expect by chance, at the mouth of the Columbia. Next slide. These two are images pulled from studies, and just real quickly, those of you who live out here in the Pacific Northwest, like I do, will recognize this coastline, and that little hot spot, the red spot, is this is sort of a compilation of acoustic and tag data, which shows the sort of primary documented hotspot here is again at the mouth of the Columbia, same on the image to the far right. And the take home here being that orcas, like so many fishermen, like to fish off the mouth of the Columbia. Next slide. This is an image or a graph here created by the Center for Whale Research, and they really have spearheaded there at the center this annual survey and census of the whales, and they document every birth and death in this population, and they've tracked it for, as I said, about 40 years now. The bottom, what you're seeing, what look like mountains here, that's the Chinook salmon population from various rivers, all sort of as a compilation. And then across the top, the bar graph coming down is the number of deaths in the southern resident population. So you'll see where the troughs are in the Chinook salmon populations, and then you'll see spikes here in the number of deaths. And there's a pretty close correlation between overall Chinook abundance and southern resident killer whale deaths in the population. I should also mention that there are a couple other very well documented threats to this population, including underwater ocean noise, which makes it difficult for the animals to hunt and locate their prey, shipping noise, ferries, all of the things that have sort of industrialized our waters, and because they live close to shore, they experience a lot of that. And toxins, the waters they live in, again, are near major urban centers. and have an unfortunate amount of pollution in them. These other threats, though, I will point out, are really compounded in their impact because salmon are so scarce. So when a whale is starving, it starts to metabolize its fat, which is where it's stored all these toxins and releases them. And that's part of the theory of what's happening with the calves and the miscarriages, is because the animal is really nutritionally stressed, it's metabolizing its fat, releasing those toxins, giving it to its young unborn calf. Similarly, in a world abundant in salmon, it's less problematic to have really noisy ocean waters, but when the water is really noisy, it creates a sort of almost like a visual cloud for a whale, which detects prey by hearing it. And since the salmon are few and far between, the underwater ocean noise that problem is being compounded. Next slide. So I want to just acknowledge a couple of things. One, that orcas are obviously not the only ones suffering here, the loss of salmon. Salmon have brought abundance back to this part of the world for thousands of years, to humans who have had whole economies and diets that were centered on salmon, and a number, as the CNN video also referenced, well over 100 other species that have very documented dependence on salmon, and I would dare say it's far greater than that. So what is a whale attorney doing talking about inland dams and freshwater systems? The impact of the loss of salmon is really far-reaching. Next slide. So I wanted to mention, sort of transition to, what do we do now? We have this very sort of beloved species at the precipice of extinction. The whales were listed on the Endangered Species Act as endangered in 2005. They are currently on National Marine Fisheries list of 8 species most likely to go extinct in the very near term unless dramatic changes are made. And so there's a number of places you'll see them crop up in advocacy and in the work that, in the ways in which the work that I do and Miles's work overlaps. One place that you do see mention of the whales, although I would argue not enough, is in this long history of this case, and more recently in this history of the case, National Wildlife Federation versus NMFS, or National Marine Fisheries Service. Almost exactly 4 years ago, in May of 2016, Judge Michael Simon reviewed once again, there's been long-standing litigation about this, the management of the Columbia dams, and determined that the current management of the dams was illegal. It jeopardized the survival of 13 different salmon runs. He wrote that the rivers are so degraded they are not functional and do not serve their conservation role. And he ordered a new environmental impact review of the river system. That review was recently released in draft form. It's a number of thousands of pages, and I know Columbia Riverkeeper reviewed it, as did NRDC and many others. And it concluded in regard to the southern resident killer whales and the impact of the management of the Columbia Basin and Snake River dams on those whales. It acknowledged in its analysis of Lower Snake River Dam breaching as an alternative that that would result in, quote, a moderate to major increase in overall abundance of adult salmon over the long term, and that would increase the prey base available to killer whales. But ultimately concluded that Lower Snake River Dam removal was not chosen as the preferred alternative, and also that dam breaching would have a minor impact on the whales. And the rationale for that is one that I take issue with, but was that the whales feed on a number of different rivers systems and not just the Columbia. Next slide. So to sort of wrap us up here, with only 72 southern resident orcas left, and that number, it moves around a little bit. Some estimates are 73 now, some are 72. It's hard to document the death of a whale out in the ocean, but we, based on sightings, Center for Whale Research estimates 72 now. What do we do now? I want to mention very briefly a couple of things that are going on. There is proposed critical habitat expansion for these whales that would include and recognize the mouth of the Columbia and, in fact, the entire Oregon and Washington, almost entire Washington and entire Oregon coast as critical habitat for the species. So look for a final rule on that soon. The federal NEPA review process is still underway and will likely be litigated. The Washington State Task Force, Governor Inslee has done a fair amount to raise awareness around the plight of the orcas, and I think really responded to public pressure, and there will hopefully be a further iteration of that, not necessarily the task force, but of that conversation in Washington. The Washington water quality standards around temperature. It's an issue that Columbia Riverkeeper has really been on the lead on, and I encourage you to kind of check that out. I think there's information on their website on it. I'll just quickly note that Oregon's Governor Brown has stated her support for Snake River Dam removal, and also seems to be a growing champion for the Southern residents, which is really encouraging to see. And wrap it up by saying, in my last meeting with staff at Governor Brown's, staff from Governor Brown's office, and talking to her staff about, really what was it and what is it that is getting the governor here in Oregon more engaged. One of the pieces of information I got is that the governor's office is currently receiving 131 at that point in time letters a week on orca or salmon or both, and it's just the engagement by just all of us, and letters to your decision makers, whether it's Congress members, senators, governors, or local officials, really, while they sometimes don't feel like they are moving the issue, the cumulative impact is great. And my contact information is there. If you've got further questions on Southern residents, I'm always happy to chat. I am based here in Mosier, Oregon, just down the street from Columbia Riverkeeper. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
The first question, and I'll let you, Giulia and Miles, kind of decide how you want to field this, but folks were wondering, once the dams are removed, how long would it take for the salmon to start to rebound?
Answer is look to the Elwha. So there was a dam removal on the Elwha River that documented sort of unexpected return rate, and there was no passage of salmon before the dams were removed, and miraculously the salmon found their way back to the sort of and have recovered much more quickly than expected. So I don't have hard figures, and I think there's different ideas about, we're talking 4 dams here, whether you would take them out all at once or you would do them in some sort of sequence, and so I couldn't tell you, in the next summer you would have just a rapid increase. But I will say that, where there have been dam removals, I think the experience has been pretty universal that the return rate is surprisingly high. And Fish Passage Center, which Miles referenced before, has made some estimates about the numbers you would see, and they're significant. And so although I often get the question as an orca advocate, and you've got a species so close to extinction, why are you spending time on dam removal, which may take many years to achieve? But it's sort of that graph that Miles had with the red line through it. You're not going to get salmon back. Where else do we have this magnitude of potential? And while we're working on all of the other fronts as well, we certainly feel pretty strongly that to achieve the return rate of salmon sufficient to keep this population in recovery would require including Lower Snake River dam removal.
The question was kind of like how soon could you start to see recovery? I think, like Giulia said, I think you could start to see recovery almost immediately. I remember another dam removal, Condit Dam on the white salmon here. For folks who are familiar with the Columbia Gorge, it's a small river that flows in from the Washington side, right at Hood River. And I remember that dam came out, and it was 1 or 2 years later, I was standing where the reservoir had been, and there were Chinook salmon spawning, you know, a year or two later. These fish are incredibly resilient if we give them just a little bit of what they need. How long for full recovery to occur? I don't think anybody really knows that, but if those dams come out, I think there's a good chance that fish will start to recolonize that habitat quickly.
Thank you both. Another question that we had come in a couple different forms, so I'm trying to combine some of these questions together so we can address a few different people's concerns. But can you talk a little bit about what some of the obstacles are to dam removal and how we can facilitate, mitigating those obstacles and kind of moving forward with solutions that bring multiple stakeholders to the table?
I'm happy to jump in and Miles and let you follow up. This has been a really entrenched issue here in the region. So the politics are deep. There's ideological opposition, but there's also some real on the ground transition that would need to occur if you're going to take out. And I have to acknowledge, we are talking here in the context of climate change about removing a clean energy resource. And so, it's very important to us here at NRDC that this is not done in a way that compromises that transition to decarbonize the Pacific Northwest. And so there is energy infrastructure that needs to be considered. And that said, there are very robust and recent studies that have been done showing this is feasible. It's feasible without impairing or sacrificing reliability and adequacy for energy here in the region. There are transportation issues for farmers that are real. Farmers barge their wheat product on the Snake River, and that's made possible by those big flat reservoirs and the dams. And so how do we start using the alternatives and shipping by rail? Can we support and make all of those things feasible? And it needs to be a comprehensive solution that takes care of everyone and doesn't leave anyone behind.
Thank you, Giulia. Miles, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Great. So another question that comes up quite a bit, and I know that maybe there's no really great definitive answer, but who's the decision maker on all of this? Who, when people are thinking about what they can do and who to reach out to and who's in charge, this is a there's different states involved. So who's kind of in charge of these decisions? I know that's
sorry, Julia, I'll take this one if that's really the people who are going to make the decisions that matter about these are our elected representatives. Governor Brown, Governor Inslee, our state senators, or our federal senators and representatives. The agencies like Bonneville Power Administration, like the Army Corps, like National Marine Fisheries Service, they have shown time and time again that they are not interested in dam removal. And the culture of those agencies just does not allow them to do what needs to be done. And so, when we're thinking about who do we need to convince that Snake River dam removal is the right move for salmon, for orcas, for the Northwest, it's really down to our federal representatives, because ultimately this is going to take, it's going to take legislation to remove these dams, and that means a lot of people from different walks of life reaching out and making sure that our leaders in the Northwest know that this is a priority.
Thank you, Miles. I think I'm going to go, we're running a little over, so I'm going to do just maybe one more question before we talk about some takeaways. So in terms of the power produced by the dams and how we can replace that power, are there any kind of, you know, methods for communicating with existing entities that are in charge of that power supply and kind of convincing them that we can replace that power with more sustainable sources?
It's a good question, you know, and I probably spend more energy and I'm a bit more hopeful about the culture of the federal agencies, you know, and I think you know, the Orca issue has changed the conversation. The temperature crisis on the river has changed the conversation. Very real world impact on Native people here in the basin of the loss of salmon is changing the conversation. The politics are shifting here up at the federal level, but I also think there's some very important work to be done with your local PUD and electric co-ops, and I encourage you to get to know them. Not many environmentalists or activists pay attention to those bodies, and those elections for us in Oregon are just about a week away. Well, I don't know if there's any PUD, like I should pay attention to those elections. Sorry, and other stuff's on the ballot. I don't think my electric co-ops election is on the ballot, but shows you how much I know, right? So yeah, they are really neglected bodies, but they're also often elected and representative, and there have been a number of resolutions passed, in fact, both in Washington and Oregon by small electric co-ops and PUDs in opposition to Lower Snake River Dam removal. But we've also seen that conversation in places be reversed by engaged citizens who've really you know, asked for more information, asked for sort of a different position or a more open-minded position on the issue. And so I would say that you know, a repeat that Lower Snake River Dam removal is feasible without compromising on our clean energy transition here in this region. We all want to see us move away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy supply. And you know, we need to start being more engaged and informed citizens around those energy decisions that are being made at the local level that will put pressure on Bonneville at the, you know, at a larger scale, and also at the federal level on our representatives.
Thank you so much, Giulia. That's great. Miles, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we kind of wrap up the evening?
I don't. Giulia, thanks so much for joining us. It's really really great to hear the Orca perspective, and we're really lucky to have you on the call with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you both for being here. This was a very informative evening, and I really appreciate it. I know everyone else really appreciates it. Also, thank you to everyone who was here participating and learning more about Lower Snake River Dam removal and how important it is for the health of the rivers, the health of the salmon and the orca. So if you want to get something done tonight, you know, we have a petition on our website right now at ColumbiaRiverkeeper.org on our Take Action page, and you can go and sign the petition to remove the 4 Lower Snake River dams. And thanks for sticking with us while we had a few technical difficulties. But yeah, so thanks everyone so much, and feel free to reach out if anyone has questions. Giulia shared her contact information, and then, you know, you can also always reach out at info@ColumbiaRiverkeeper.org, and here is Giulia's info. And thanks again, everyone, and I hope you all have a great night.